Hi, I'm Kyle Harrison. Welcome back to Medical Education in the New Millennium. We've got a great lecture for you today. So our Ignite speaker is going to be Andrew Stanley. He got his his bachelor's in mechanical engineering and applied mechanics from University of Pennsylvania. Then he came to Stanford and joined us. He has been here. He's already gotten his master's, working on his PhD, and he's working in the collaborative haptics and robotics lab with Allison Amakura, and he specifically focuses on particle jamming as an encounter type haptic display for medical simulation. And then followed by that, we're going to have Christine Park on her talk on Beauty and the Beast, I think is the term that she's used. So that's going to be exciting. So we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Welcome to Medical Education in the New Millennium, a new course from the Stanford University School of Medicine. This interdisciplinary course is produced by Stanford Med X and features talks from thought leaders and innovators from medical education, instructional design, cognitive science, online learning, and emerging technology. Over the course of 11 weeks, we'll consider how to build educational experiences that address the unique learning preferences of today's millennial medical students and residents, address gaps in the current medical education system, and explore what might be accomplished when all healthcare stakeholders are included in the conversation. If you are joining us for the first time, a quick reminder that there's a simultaneous conversation happening on Twitter right now using the hashtag MedX. Christopher Snyder, otherwise known as I Am Spartacus, is the in-class moderator for today's program and will be taking questions from social media. So please make sure to start up your Twitter client to join in the online conversation and interact with today's speakers. Please also make sure to like our Facebook page at www.facebook.com/Stanford Med X. Please note, you are watching a live online program, and there is a delay between real-time events and the live stream you are watching. Tweets from our in-class guests will appear before you see the real-time events they are tweeting about unfold on the video live stream.
Hello everyone, and thank you for the introduction. Today I'm going to be talking about encountered type haptic displays for medical simulation. And the goal here is to give you a little bit of an engineer's perspective on medical education, and specifically the role that haptics can play in medical simulation. For those of you who aren't familiar with haptics, I'm going to give you a little introduction to that. And haptics broadly is really anything that has anything to do with the sense of touch. But if you've heard the term haptics before, I would imagine it's probably something to do with cell phones, whereas you transition from real keyboard buttons to touch screens, you lose that sense of touch and you no longer have the haptic feedback of feeling the button clicks. So a lot of cell phone manufacturers will try to recreate this haptic sensation by vibrating the phone as you touch it to signify a button click. But in the haptics research community, we really think of vibrations as very one-dimensional, not as rich of haptic feedback as you could potentially provide. So something more typical of what you'll see in a haptics research lab is this little tabletop robot here that my ex-labmate is holding on to. And this allows you to get haptics in 3 or more degrees of freedom. So essentially this acts as kind of a fancy mouse where as Anne moves this cursor around in space on the tabletop, it'll move a cursor in 3 dimensions in a virtual environment on the computer screen. And this acts in both directions. So as it sends the motion signals to the computer, as that dot then interacts with this teapot, as you poke the edge of the teapot, it can then send force signals back to the user, so that in three dimensions you can feel the edges of this teapot and kind of feel the actual forces and haptics of this environment. And another application is if you replace this virtual environment with a teleoperated robot, you can then use this haptic interface to control the end position of that robot. And instead of feeling virtual forces now, the user of this haptic device is feeling the forces that this robot is feeling in the actual environment. So if any of you are familiar with the Da Vinci surgical system, that's an example of a teleoperated robot where it might be useful to have haptic feedback so that the surgeon can feel what you're feeling inside of the body. And with these haptic interfaces, you can really create a very broad spectrum of virtual environments ranging from soft tissues to the contours of a rigid skull. And there's really a lot you can simulate here. So if we look at the role that haptics plays in medical simulation today, there's kind of two ends of the spectrum here. On one end of the spectrum, we have these haptic interfaces that I just described that really give you a lot of freedom to program dynamic environments and quickly change the environment. But you're feeling everything through this tooltip. You're no longer reaching out and touching that environment as you would be with something on the other end of the spectrum like a mannequin, whereas you can actually physically explore this haptic environment directly with your hands, but it's not necessarily something you can reprogram to change to be a different object. So what we've asked in our lab is whether we can have the best of both worlds here. Can we have something that you can reprogram to change shape and feel like different things, but still have it be something that you interact directly with your hands rather than feeling it through this tool? So the grant that we're working on is this encountered type medical simulator. Encountered type in the sense that you physically reach out and encounter this haptic display that's mounted onto this 6 degree of freedom kinesthetic robot. And we pair this with 3D visualization and interchangeable tactile displays. And this is the robotic interface that our collaborators have developed to move this tactile display around in space with hand tracking so that as you reach the different areas of the virtual environment, you can feel different things. And our job here at Stanford was this goal of developing a tactile display for medical simulation with controllable geometry and material properties. For example, for, say, procedures where clinicians use their sense of touch to make a diagnosis, like palpating a body and trying to localize a tumor, and being able to differentiate through your sense of touch what's a tumor and what's, say, a cyst or something else like that. And to accomplish this, we're using a technology called particle jamming. And for those of you, if you've ever bought a coffee that's been vacuum sealed, you're probably familiar with particle jamming. Or if you have a flexible membrane and you fill it with granular materials, if you apply vacuum to it, it's very rigid. So when you first buy the coffee, it's like a rigid brick. But if you release the vacuum, it becomes soft and pliable. And this gives you an opportunity to change the mechanical properties of this device. And some of the prototypes that we built using particle jamming, here's a quick video of some early prototypes where using a bunch of these little particle jamming cells, you can change the material properties and combine it with pneumatics. And even though there's only a small number of particle jamming cells here, you can see we can already create kind of a variety of shapes of different stiffnesses and different sizes. And you can imagine these little particle jamming cells as kind of like pixels in an image, where the more cells you have, the greater variety of things that you can display as a haptic interface. So I'm going to go ahead and these are some schematics of kind of the engineering of what's going on underneath this all. It's combining the particle jamming with pneumatics. I'm going to kind of run through it, but if you'd like to discuss the engineering aspects of it later offline, I'd be happy to do that. And before I go, I'd like to just mention briefly that when you're working as an engineer in medical fields, collaboration is really key to continuously improve your prototype. It's important that when you're building things that you continue to check in with your clinical collaborators to make sure what you're building isn't just cool, but also useful in a medical situation. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. And our main speaker today will be Dr. Christine Park. Christine Park is an associate professor of anesthesia and the director of the Center for Clinical Simulation at Northwestern University. She completed her medical school at the Indiana University School of Medicine and residency at Harvard Brigham and Women's Hospital. And we'll hear from Dr. Park after a short message from Medicine X.
In 2015, Medicine X will be launching a new program called Medicine X Ed. This special conference, right before Medicine X 2015, will focus on medical education and what might be accomplished when all healthcare stakeholders can engage in a conversation about changing the culture of medicine through educational innovation. Of course, we'll discuss the role technology can play in medical education, but we'll also look at gaps in our current educational system, such as participatory medicine, shared decision-making, patient engagement, cost transparency, patient safety and reducing harm, and cross-cultural competencies. What other gaps might we address at Medicine X Ed? Let us know what you think by tweeting our hashtag MedX. And make sure to sign up online to learn more about Medicine X Ed and how you can get involved.
Hi, good evening. I'm Christine Park, and have the pleasure and honor of being here tonight. First, I want to apologize for my voice. I'm just getting over some laryngitis, so I might cough or get a little more hoarse than I am right now. I'd like to talk to you tonight about simulation, but it's really a story, and as I've entitled it, it's a tale of Beauty and the Beast. So when we think about the beauty side, the beauty of education is that we have an interest in imparting knowledge, imparting skills, and to borrow from the Olympic phrase of swifter, higher, stronger, in medicine we have Citius, swifter, indeed, we're always under time pressure, Tutius, safer, and finally sine iram, without error. And these are some of our goals, and these are some of the things that we do beautifully in education. And here's what we're kind of talking about. We're trying to make sense of nonsense in a way. And this is one of my favorite quotes that says, "To the uneducated, an A is just 3 sticks." And I'd like to demonstrate to you that everybody in this room is an expert reader, and an A is not just 3 sticks. And I'd like you to read this bit of text that's just about to come up here. Go ahead and read that. So I'm willing to bet that everybody here was able to read this bit of text with minimal to no reduction in your speed or accuracy of reading. Why is that? Well, when you're an expert reader, you actually don't read every letter sequentially. You look at the first letter, the last letter, and you get some kind of gestalt about what's going on in between. And the context drives your ability to read this text. And so this is a sort of a miniature example of what's going on with expertise. A lot of people talk about the importance of being able to learn and recognize patterns immediately in a way that's much faster and more accurate than somebody who's not trained or not an expert. And so simulation is something that has been used historically to try and teach expertise. And I'd like to show you that actually simulation, even though we think of it as a new thing, is actually quite an ancient concept. So some of you might know that the first simulation mannequin, in the way that we might recognize it today, first made its appearance in the 1960s and made the cover of Life magazine. This mannequin could do things that our current mannequins today could not. For example, for those of you who know anything about anesthesiology, it could cough and buck on an endotracheal tube, and it could also fasciculate when you gave succinylcholine. So it was some amazing technology. But it disappeared, in part because some of the uses were relatively mundane, about teaching novice residents how to do intubations. And you can think this much technology, especially in the 60s, to support something that was relatively more mundane, perhaps wasn't something that was sustainable. Now, if we go back a few hundred years to 17th century France, we see that in a way they were using simulation in their own way too. So this is kind of a carved mannequin that was used to teach obstetrics and the path of labor. And you can see that this mannequin is in a lot of pain. She doesn't have an epidural, and she's trying to give birth. So we're going back a few hundred years now. But if we go back even close to 1,000 years, we see that in China, these mannequins were used to teach acupuncture. And some of these mannequins were kind of interesting. If you hit the right channel, you would get positive feedback in the form of a little bit of mercury, which probably wasn't the best idea in retrospect. But this notion of using simulation in healthcare is actually quite an ancient one. I told you that I was going to tell you a story of Beauty and the Beast, and this is relevant here. One of my questions is, what are some of the unintended consequences of training? So for all the good things we do, what are we not noticing? Does anybody know who Ignaz Semmelweis is? So he was a physician in couple of hundred years ago who actually, before Louis Pasteur, first noticed this concept of asepsis. And this is what he noticed, that the maternal death rate in the wards covered by physicians and medical students was sometimes up to 10 times higher than the death rate in the wards covered by nurses. And he really did an in-depth analysis of why that would be. The patients were the same. He even looked at the religion. The religion was the same. Everything was the same. He finally realized that the one difference was that the medical students were coming straight from the cadaver lab, which you can imagine in those days those cadavers weren't preserved, and putting their dirty hands into women who were laboring and helping them. And so that was the reason why these women were dying. He introduced a kind of a aseptic technique where people basically put their hands in, I don't know, hydrochloric acid or something horrible, bleach. And he noticed that magically the death rate went down. So this graph here just shows sort of the massive difference in the death rate in the physician clinic versus the nurse's clinic. So this is the story here, really, that people usually tell this as a story of sort of the first physician who noticed the importance of clean technique. And incidentally, people thought he was crazy. He was put into an insane asylum, and he died within 2 weeks of being admitted from sepsis, from being beaten by guards. So that is, it's really, I don't know, it's a sort of a tragic story. But the other side of this is he noticed an unintended consequence of training all those years ago. So how is it that bad things happen, and how is it that people make mistakes, which is one part of leading to bad things happening? I showed you earlier that you all were expert readers by being able to instantly pattern recognize. And so I'd like you to look at this here. It's a figure with glasses. You can see sort of pensively, perhaps seriously, looking downwards. And I'd like to ask if you can see anything differently in this. Call it out if you can. Liar. If you can't see liar, try turning your head to the right, almost 90 degrees. There's the word liar. So here's a small visual evidence of perhaps the downside of being an expert pattern recognizer. Once your brain has seen something in a certain way, sometimes it's very hard to see it in a different way. Here's another example. So this cluster of characters, read left to right, easy, ABC, no problem. Is it ABC or is it 12, 13, 14? The same character in the center. So the context that's surrounding the information you're receiving can powerfully affect how you interpret information. This is going to be a little exercise. I'm going to cue you. I'll cue you when it's time to call out the answer. So Mary's mother had 4 daughters, April, May, June, and... Who said Mary? Somebody said Mary. So most people say July. The vast majority of people say July because your brain says, I know the months of the year, I know the sequence. Your brain decides to fill in that blank without really thinking further. But we have a smart audience, so I knew some of you would get Mary. Most people say July. I want you to give me this answer as fast as you can, your fast, intuitive answer. A ball and a bat cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? 10 cents. I heard some 10 cents. I heard some 5 cents. So the intuitive answer here is 10 cents. But actually the correct answer is 5 cents. So another example of sort of how intuition may not always be the best thing. So I'm going to now sort of take a dive into this whole world of metacognition, who is the beast in this story. The thought is here that we all have 2 systems of thinking. System 1 is the intuitive side. This is an essential function for life. It allows you to go around living your life without obsessively thinking over every detail of what you are doing at every moment of the day. Albert Einstein said the intuitive mind is a sacred gift. It's powerful. We usually think about developing intuition as a sort of critical piece of developing expertise. And that's true. The problem with System 1 is that it's prone to bias. It relies on the most readily available answers. It's a snap judgment kind of system. It's completely not capable of any statistical thinking, and it's prone to judgment errors because of that. The other system, system 2, is the rational side. This is who you know to be your thinking self. It's the side that can calculate, that can be suspicious, question, and really think analytically about the problem at hand. But system 2 has its problems also. It, by default, is in an off state. It's slow, it's relatively lazy. It really wants to defer to system 1. It's easily distracted, overwhelmed and fatigued, and heavily impacted by time pressure. Well, guess what? Those are all of the things that affect us in healthcare practice today. So here is the problem. Both of these systems are essential for optimal functioning in life. But unless your system 2 is activated, our judgments and decisions are really going to be driven almost exclusively by your system 1 snap judgment side. So here was the question that we really had, which is if you give somebody a hammer, if you teach somebody to use a hammer, is everything now going to look like a nail? So the rest of the story now is going to take place in the context of emergency airway management among anesthesiology residents. We wanted to look at this concept of training-induced bias, or if you teach somebody to use a hammer, will everything look like a nail, in the context of emergency airway management. And we did it because these surprise, unanticipated, difficult airways are serious problems in anesthesia, and we spend a lot of energy around teaching our residents how to prepare for and train for this event. So the emergency airway algorithm goes something like this. It's simplified, but here it is. You start with attempt to breathe for the patient with a mask. You then try to place a breathing tube in them. If that doesn't work, you place what we're going to call an SGA. I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. And if that doesn't work, your last step is cricothyroidotomy, which is cutting open the neck and sticking the tube directly in the trachea. So these are the two the penultimate and ultimate rescue airway techniques. Supraglottic airways, or SGA, they're used routinely, actually, in anesthesia practice. Thousands of these are placed every day. They're usually learned on the job. There's really no point in teaching it in the sim lab if you're going to get hundreds of exposures within your first several months of training. And this is a picture of it. It's a sort of a rubbery thing, and it's not that difficult to place. You just stick it in the mouth, and it sticks in the back of the mouth, and you can help breathe for the patient using this device. However, cricothyroidotomy is a completely different beast. It's a rare event. It has high risk. It has incredibly high consequences. And simulation is the perfect method to teach residents about this procedure. So here's how we teach it in our lab. We have a sort of a torso, and we place explanted animal tissue in there with some skin that goes over the top that actually can bleed. And we teach residents to do this procedure in this manner. And this was our hypothesis in this study, which was we felt that if you taught a resident only one of those two techniques, you could get a resident to fixate to that technique and that technique only, so that you would see incomplete adherence to this difficult airway algorithm, that they would not have all the tools in the toolkit. And then we felt that if we actually train them in now both techniques, and we use two different sequences, we would see a correction of this bias. And I'm going to give you the answer right away, which is that we were able to show that by training them in only one technique, they fixated to that one technique. But here came the big surprise, which is that once the residents got trained in both techniques, we did not see a correction of the bias. And I'm going to show you what problem we saw. So here's the sequence of training. We had two groups. The SGA group starts with the SGA training, followed by the cricothyroidotomy training. The cric group, conversely, starts with the cricothyroidotomy training and moves to the SGA training. And here are the results. So our chief finding was a major asymmetry in their performance, or in what we observed because of the training sequence. And the training first in the cricothyroidotomy technique caused a bias that, strangely, didn't correct. So here we have cricothyroidotomy performance. So this is the cutting of the neck. When we see, look at the red line. That's the group that trained first in cricothyroidotomy. You see, by the time they get training, we see an appropriate bump in their level of showing that technique, versus the blue line, who started first in SGA. At this point, they haven't received training in cricothyroidotomy. Their performance remains flat, exactly as predicted. And at the final test, again as predicted. So they've both gotten training in this cricothyroidotomy technique. So by the time we get to the final test, they all show evidence of acquisition of this skill. Now let's go to the performance of SGA. It starts off looking quite similar. The blue line is your SGA trained group. The red line is your cric trained group. You see a nice split in performance. And by the end, we should expect that they both converge up at the top, but they don't. So if you're the red line, a group that started first in training in cricothyroidotomy, we saw absolutely no evidence of adoption of SGA as a technique at the final test. So once they learned cric, they really seemed to fixate on that technique and not show the new technique, the second technique. So we felt that this was a problem. Not only that, we saw a really interesting difference in the response times. So the top bar is the cricothyroidotomy first training group, and the bottom bar is the SGA first training group. What we see in the cric group is we see a longer time until the decision to initiate supraglottic airway, and we see a compressed time to the decision to cricothyroidotomy. So when we look at this interval time, which is sort of the rescue window here, we see that it is half of that of the supraglottic airway group. Now, I'm not in a position to say who's wrong and who's right in these two groups, but what I can certainly say is that they both can't be right. And we see this much of a difference based on a simple manipulation of the training sequence. As it turns out, this phenomenon is not isolated to us. It's evident in the US Air Force. For US Air Force pilots, the sequence and sort of the strength of stimuli that they get affects how they make decisions. We see it in forensic identification. So based on the sequence that you present, fingerprints, and the context that you provide around that can make people decide that fingerprints are a match when they're not, and that they're a mismatch when they in fact are a match. And finally, we actually found evidence in our own medical literature that we believe that this phenomenon is happening on the level of practicing physicians as well. So this study was from a Canadian Journal of Anesthesiology in 2010, practicing anesthesiologists who had a 1-hour course in cricothyroidotomy. What they observed is after the training, they saw a great reduction in the decision time to initiate cricothyroidotomy, and the number of people who bypassed that really important SGA rescue step was nearly doubled. We don't know if these authors actually knew what they were seeing, but we think that they also have shown that this problem of training-induced bias exists on the level of practicing physicians as well. And so some of my challenges to you all are to think really about how do we design cognitively informed curricula. It's really not enough anymore just to push the education out the door and be happy that the students performed well on the test or the practical exam or the whatever we have. And also, what kinds of bias are at play here? So our study was not powered to discover what kind of bias was at play. In fact, we didn't expect to see it. And so now we need to figure out what's going on. Primacy, salence, there's all kinds of bias out there. And what are the inherent thinking patterns of trainees? So if you're a resident who starts in psychiatry or you're a resident who starts in surgery, do those people have inherently different thinking patterns in terms of their System 1 and System 2 bias? I don't know. And finally, what happens to those thinking patterns under conditions of load, depletion, stress, and time pressure? And what happens to those? And these are all, for me, really ripe areas for study for the future. Thank you very much.
right, so now we're going to open up for questions from the audience as well as from the Twitter feed.
So the imperfection of medical training, it's really hard to get rid of bias. No, from different background, just like you say, the order of training cannot be remedied by collaborative practicing of treatment, especially in pairing. My previous career was in medical genetics, and there's a lot of bias there, and then moving to software programming, I found lessons in pair programming, especially on diverse programmers. We get to see each other's blind spot and would comment each other's work. Would that work in the medical professions? Collaborative.
That's a
Teamwork.
great question. I think the short answer is yes. The interesting challenge is under conditions of time pressure, and a situation of an emergency airway here, you may, from start to finish, may be a matter of seconds or certainly minutes. So our scenarios in our study were designed to go 5 minutes long, which is perhaps even a little long for some of these events. So the great challenge would be under those conditions of time pressure where there's likely to be a lot of noise and chaos in the room and sort of a lot of adrenaline energy, how do we, in that moment, sort of undertake a robust collaborative process of problem solving? And that's another great area of study.
So second question, is there any suggestion how to remedy that, the order of training? Because it's really hard to, once you get trained in one, and SG.
So we did in the second year of this study, one of our reviewers said, well, obviously you didn't explain the risks and benefits of these procedures, so that's why you saw this divide, and why didn't you do that? So we said, oh, that's a great idea. And so in the second year we did introduce the risks and benefits, and once again we were shocked, and we're right now in the process of manuscript preparation for the results of that study. It does make a very big difference, but it's not all roses. Yes.
So in terms of simulation, you have like an evaluation part after, I'm sure, so you can learn from what you did right or wrong or what you should have done or could have done. Mm-hmm. And that seems, simulation as a technique training seems different than simulation as a attitude, paradigm, sort of perspective training. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if at the beginning of class we were talking about fidelity and stakes.
Yeah.
Is simulation in certain environments, and this would depend on the time frame involved, but is it a place where we can play with essentially, how do I say this, lying to the participants in a way that we can't do in non-simulation? So you perform a technique properly or you identify something properly, but the simulation pulls that and then tells you at the end that you were wrong. Not in fact to tell you you're wrong, mm-hmm. but to cue you into the fact that there is an alternative, that you should have looked at an alternative. I mean, there's a difference between using it as a teaching tool for technique versus some sort of greater narrative or something.
Yeah. Oh, yes. So that's another great comment. There's a lot of developing work out there looking at the process of training and simulation and how to optimize that. So you're right. You don't always take an event from start to finish and just go through it. Sometimes you can take just a slice of it, or you can freeze frame. What we're doing is trying to do a little bit of that manually, actually, is to teach our learners some cognitive skills and habits where we'll freeze a simulation, we'll ask them to stop and think. Are you sure that's what you really want to do? And then sort of restart again. So, and that technique of sort of the freeze frame has been well described.
So I had a question, and I wonder, could you look at your study in another light and think, it's actually great that they went straight to Crike, because in the real world, you're not going to be able to do it so often. You put in the SGA so many more times than a Crike. So perhaps it's a good thing that your learners decided to elect to do Crike, because simulation may be their only opportunity to do so. In the real world, it's just not as done as often.
I think that has been the traditional belief that we really don't want our residents to be scared to do Crike. And if you've never done it, you're going to be scared to do it. We saw that in half of our trainees in the first half of the study. The problem is, if you are now bypassing a critical rescue step to go straight to the end, that's a problem. So, and that's what we saw.
Okay, we now have a question from Twitter from our user Courage Sings. If we are programmed to fall into that bias, how do you navigate around the bias? Is it possible?
If we're programmed to fall into that bias, how do we navigate around the bias? Well, in my ideal world, going back to the construct of System 1 and System 2 thinking, we would create learners who would exist in System 1, which is important, but they would have the capacity to make a quick detour over to System 2, and it's almost like you were saying, sort of a stop, think, weigh pros, cons, risks, benefits, what have you, and then come back and either confirm or go to a different path. I mean, the issue here is, it's already come up, is there's no way to get rid of bias. In fact, bias is critical to survival. I mean, there's certain things that you just know. So we're not talking about getting rid of bias, but we're talking about trying to provide learners with the cognitive skills to not fall into the traps.
One thing I wonder about is what about the possibility of just making residents aware of this bias? I think you hear about that in terms of like kind of cultural biases that people have. Yeah. That one way of remedying that is just make yourself aware, and that will help you reduce kind of the decision making based on that.
That's a great question, and I thought about that. Decision science, the literature in decision science seems to show, especially when it comes to high-risk, time-pressured decisions, and this was actually studied not in healthcare but in other domains, that making learners aware of the bias didn't do anything. And I think there's something with that time pressure and that high risk that really keeps a person from being able to heed the warning, so to speak. The author's name is Paul Slovic, by the way, if you're interested in reading, S-L-O-V-I-C.
Could you speak more about the freeze frame sort of design? Could you speak about the freeze frame concept and design, and how that would be used in either in your simulations or other simulations?
Well, the basic premise is this. No matter how bad the emergency, you always have a few seconds to check in with either yourself or with some colleagues in a collaborative manner. So we really want to push to the residents not to feel that in the next 1 second they need to make an absolute decision. Maybe in the next 10 seconds they do. But in those 10 seconds, so in the simulation, we actually freeze it for much longer. We give them a minute. And we ask them, what's your gut instinct on this, to do X? And why is it? Give me a reason why you shouldn't do this. What are some other options? Now that you've named me 3 other options, is there anything that rises to a higher level of priority than the one you instinctively threw out there? If there is, you go with that. If there's not, you sort of continue. And we do that as sort of a out loud internal dialogue with themselves. But in fact, as I am thinking about it, it's a great idea to think about doing it collaboratively, as you mentioned, in a room, to say, I'm about to do procedure X. Anybody think of a reason why I shouldn't do it? Is there any other option I haven't considered yet? Why not?
So you spoke about the modification of the experiment, building the risks and the benefits into the training. Have you given any thought to how that could also be built into the simulation? So could the simulation be responsive to decisions and be able to project a survival rate or something like that?
It's incredibly difficult to, because the rate of these emergency airways is so low in the real world, and each situation is so incredibly different that we couldn't build any sort of formula in the sim to respond in real time in a way that would be accurate.
I've been toying this idea that the IBM Watson is gathering information, data, and getting, it's like machine learning from all the data coming up, all the scenarios. I wonder that can be used for real life situation and like a medical decision assistance. No, it's not the ultimate decision making, but it helps the physicians form the final decision.
I was thinking about that just a few days ago, actually. I think Watson seems to show some incredible promise in terms of diagnostic accuracy. So Watson can mine the EMR and come up with many more data points to help you say, well, this isn't really a heart attack, this is a kidney stone, or I don't know what, based on the patient's medications and all this other stuff and that data. I wonder how it would be in a real-time, high-risk, very quickly evolving situation where you don't have kind of a more or less static patient who's sitting on the floor for a week. You have a patient that looks dramatically different 30 seconds ago than now, and in 30 seconds it's going to look different. I don't know. I wonder. Yes.
What would be interesting about that situation in the emergency department, that is what happens, and you have to act with minimal data. And so Watson could be fantastic, except in a real emergency situation. If you're not Watson, you have to be able to act and make decisions on half data that potentially could be false, data that is either inputted incorrectly, and you still have to be comfortable making decisions, and that certainly is not what Watson would do.
Yeah.
The physician will have the final decision.
Not Watson?
No.
But you wonder whether, talk about bias, if Watson is telling you, crack the patient, and you say, but I can see the vocal cords. No, I don't know. I mean, if the situation is a little muddier than that, I wonder what that would do. Yeah.
Watson, I don't know if he's smart enough for those issues.
Ethical dilemmas?
Sorry.
It's. Yeah.
Watson's feelings won't be hurt.
Yeah.
I have a question for Andrew, actually. Can you talk about any kinds of use cases where you've been able to employ haptics for medical training and what kind of preliminary results you've gotten?
So at least, am I supposed to talk in the mic or is this on? No. So we're actually pretty early on in development of, or at least of the project that I'm working on. So we haven't actually deployed it in medical simulation per se, but like I mentioned towards the end of my presentation, we do try to bring in clinicians and clinician educators as frequently as we can to get them to try out our prototypes and give us feedback as we iterate through the prototypes in terms of what we can improve to make it more more useful and more realistic for medical scenarios. But we haven't run any large studies in actual simulation environments yet. I think that'll be a little bit further down the line, at least in our project.
For your study, do you think there's something about the fun of the risk that makes people want to do the crike over the SGA? Like maybe that it's like difficult and hard, and it's just something that they gravitate toward because it's risky?
Yeah, so you're in a way talking about salience, and we think that's definitely at play for this study, where there's something inherently kind of, like you said, a sort of, it seems dangerous, and there's blood. So it definitely stands out more, and if you take into account the fact that the SGA is something that's used every day, in fact, you have a reduced salience for that, so there's actually almost no novelty, even to a brand new anesthesia resident, to learning how to place an SGA, so we have this divide on salience. But the problem is, once they get training in both, you would think that that would equal out. So if you were somebody who started with the ho-hum procedure, and then you got the exciting procedure, you should now refixate to the exciting, but we didn't see that. So there's something about order effects. There's clearly an influence of salience and sort of some learning experience that stands out more that's at play.
Zooming out from the sort of like specific educational context to a broader context of medical education within the medical profession and sort of system, are you noticing any kind of feedbacks, or can you talk about any kind of ways that these studies and these simulations and knowledge generated about these biases feed back into the system without having to wait for a crop of people who've gone through it to sort of, propagate throughout the entire system? Is there a process or channel for that to happen?
Well, this is kind of an opening foray into exploration of these questions. And I heard shortly after this paper came out from our orthopedic colleagues that they're noticing the same thing in two different kinds of hip fracture repairs. That even though there are clear reasons for and against each of the two techniques, that the residents seem to just do whatever it is the first one that they learn. So, what I hope for is just sort of a wide dissemination and sort of a thought process about this problem. And I think we're going to need to partner with our colleagues who are cognitive psychologists and decision scientists to really be able to go further and to try to minimize that feedback time, like you said. Because right now we kind of are in a place where we say we've had this crazy observation, and now we got to do something about it. And we want to do something about it next week.
So you kind of touched on this with one of your other responses, but if the order of training kind of informs a selection bias, and telling them about their selection bias doesn't do anything, is the solution then to just have contingencies in place to account for that? I mean, like the example that you said was that if a doctor has a decision and then he would collaborate and say, does anybody else have any other thought on that? Is that the only way to kind of account for that, or to work around it if there is no direct intervention on the selection bias itself?
No, I don't think so. I think that there's a lot that we can do in the training itself, although the collaboration piece would be a really important security. But let's take, for example, that we have a salience of Crike because it's just inherently just more exciting. Maybe what we do in education is kind of really suppress the exciting nature of the cricothyroidotomy training and teach with a lot more excitement around the supraglottic airway. Maybe that's what it takes to even out the bias. I don't know. But if we know that there's these kinds of issues at play, then we can manipulate them in a way that we've not really thought about before.
I had a quick question. What role do you think checklists or cognitive aids might play in correcting for cognitive bias? So as the thought experiment, what if there was a label on the cricothyrotomy tray that you had to break through before you could get access to it that said, have you thought of an SGA?
That would be a sort of, I don't know if that would be a checklist function. It's kind of an interesting force function that, maybe it doesn't allow you to break open the crike tray until you answer yes or no.
Or just, prompting, have you thought? Is there a role for
I think that there absolutely is. The problem is there's always a situation in which you do need to bypass that step. So it's not 100%, you should 1,000% always follow this. There's certain select occasions where you need to bypass. So how can we create a checklist that's dynamic enough to adjust for these? And then the other piece of it too is I would need it, maybe Google Glass is an application. I would need it right here. When I'm at the airway dealing with a problem and my heart's racing, I'm not going to say, oh, by the way, Larry, can you pull out the cognitive aid from the crash cart? So I think there's definitely a role. We're talking about access. We're talking about design of those cognitive aids so that when I look at it in a panic, I can instantly access the information I need.
But I really like
Yeah.
what you said in the team training part about asking for input from other people.
Yeah.
And in a way, that can be your check as well.
Yes.
Just calling out, does anyone have another idea?
Yes. Yeah.
I'm curious what your debriefings were after these experiments with the learners, because you're saying that there is a right answer, that it should have gone SGA and then Craig.
Mm-hmm.
But for what happens when you had learners in the room that said, no, in this scenario, Craig was the right answer, and I don't agree with you, and I was right? How do you go about debriefing in that situation?
So it's a great question. We actually, for this study, did not debrief. We did technical training only. And because our question, the specific question that we wanted to answer is a lot of technical training is just technical training. Just bring the learners down to the lab, show them how to put in the central line or the do whatever, and there's very little context provided around that, or even debriefing around the decision-making process. We wanted to duplicate what we think is happening surrounding most airway training modalities, and therefore we didn't debrief. And most certainly, if we did, we would have affected the way they made decisions. And that sort of by itself is a concept of intervention for modifying bias.
It may would have also informed what you found as well, given some insight into why the groups who were trained in which order, why they did what they did.
Yeah, it's actually a very difficult decisions that we had to make around this. We really did want to do some qualitative analyses. We couldn't do it because by doing so, at any time before the end of the study, we would have affected their future decision making. And we really wanted to only look at the impact of the technical training.
Do we know anything about the if how true to real life people's decisions are on simulation? Like if the same person, the same trained person is working on a simulator or working on a real patient, how similar their decisions will be?
So a great question, we don't know. And we'll likely never know because the ability to sort of match the cases would be low, plus the incidence is low. We thought about that. We thought about that long and hard. We'll never really know whether those results reflect what those residents would have done in real life. But for us, if it was enough of an eye-opener to know that just a sequence caused, even in just simulation, such a huge difference in decision-making. Now, we do know anecdotally that I have a personal bias that we actually are clinically seeing some evidence of a training-induced bias in real life. But that's something that I can't disclose for confidentiality reasons.
You mentioned about Google Glass. I do have a Google Glass looking for an apps to develop. Is it possible to use that? Is it helpful to use the Google Glass to do that freeze frame simulations as you're being trained to do certain tasks and it prompt you?
If only I had 5 pairs of Google Glass, I could do that study and let you know.
Oh, I have one. I could volunteer. Often.
Yeah, great concept.
You think it would be helpful? You think?
I think it would.
All right, so we're going to end with one last question from the Twitter feed. How interdisciplinary should we go in shared decision making?
how interdisciplinary should we go in shared decision making? I'm trying to figure out how to answer that question. I mean, I would say full thickness, always. The question is, who at the end of the line, is there sort of is it a democratic process in which 5 of the people in the room say you should do one thing and 2 of the people say another thing? Is it the 5 who win? Or is it always a single person? And is it from what specialty, from what profession, who ultimately will say, this is what we're going to go forward with? Maybe I'll defer to Watson on that. But I think in terms of the process of decision making, it always should be, because people from different disciplines and different professions are seeing something different than you're seeing, and they have their own bias, but it's a different one. And that should be helpful in terms of being able to put together the information.
All right, so before we wrap up, we'd like to send a special thanks to Ian Pereira, Annette McKinnon, @ZebraFinch, Bruce Ramshaw, and the MedEd chat group for sharing their hashtag. And with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you all for your attention.
If you like what you see in this class, be sure to check out our online course, Engage and Empower Me, a new online class from the Stanford University School of Medicine. We are featuring presentations from patients and experts on participatory medicine. Through this course, we hope to empower you to take part in creating a more inclusive and collaborative healthcare system. The course can be found at class.stanford.edu. As a reminder, this program is made possible by support from the Stanford University School of Medicine, Department of Anesthesia, Stanford AIM Lab, Stanford Hospital and Clinics, and the Agency for Healthcare Research Quality. If you haven't yet done so, please take a moment to like our Facebook page at www.facebook.com/Stanford Med X so you can continue the conversation online and stay informed of program updates. From all of us here at Stanford Medicine X, we want to thank you for joining us today and remind you to join us again next Thursday, October 30th at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for another edition of Stanford Medicine X Live, featuring a new class on medical education from the Stanford University School of Medicine called Medical Education in the New Millennium. Next week, we are featuring Cardiff University Professor Anne Marie Cunningham. For all of you out there taking time to tune in with us tonight, thank you for joining us and being part of the conversation. A special thanks to our guest panelists this evening. From all of us at Stanford Medicine X, we'll see you next time.